We are here to have a conversation with Sherman Cruz about his work, his new game, Dreams and Disruptions, and to talk about the field, Foresight Field, and to provide a venue for all of you to pose your questions and have a conversation with Sherman yourself. So Sherman and I will be talking for about 20 or 30 minutes and interview, and then we will open it up to questions. So please do put your questions in the Q&A of the Zoom, and we'll be collecting those, and we'll spend a good chunk of time at the end just talking about whatever you want to talk about. Just in case you're not familiar with Zoom, I know everyone uses different platforms. Please do introduce yourself when you talk into the chat. Make sure you've selected everyone and not host and panelists, because then no one else will be able to see you. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll also be monitoring the chat. So if you end up putting them there, that's also fine. So we're going to do a quick welcome to IFTF. We'll have the conversation with Sherman, who is UNESCO Chair on Anticipatory Governments and Regenerative Cities at Northwestern University in the Philippines. He is the chair of the Premier Association of Professional Futurists, so really important to foresight practitioners around the world, and the director of his own Center for Engaged Foresight. The webinar will be recorded, and we will have it available, and we'll be sending it out. We'll also be posting it online. Institute for the Future, in case you don't know us, is an independent public interest organization. We're 55 years old this year, and we do research, we do training, and we are focused on helping individuals and organizations become future ready. So very briefly, these are the kinds of things that I lead at the Institute, and this is the Foresight Talks webinar series is part of our Foresight Essentials training portfolio and our resources for learning. We have a wonderful archive of these kinds of conversations if you haven't visited it. These are the classes that we have both for individuals, open enrollment, and for teams. In case you're interested in any of them, these are the ones that are coming up really soon. Our new 3 Horizons of AI class, which has been really fun. Our Foresight Essentials training, which provides kind of comprehensive training in professional foresight. And then we have a new program specifically for leaders in philanthropy. We also have these webinars, we have a newsletter, we have meetups, we have a Urgent Optimist community platform. We have so many different things. So do check out IFTF and our resources online. With that, I am going to stop my sharing and I stop my slide sharing and get into the conversation with, I'm going to take a quick look at the chat. Wonderful to see everyone. Thank you so much. We love seeing all the different folks from around the world. Sherman, welcome to IFTF Foresight Talks. So glad to have you here. Been looking forward to this. And I was hoping that you could get us started off. We're really here to talk about your game and the design of the game and the impact that you're trying to create. But before we get there, can you just tell us a little bit about how you yourself came to the futures field?
Yes, looking back and reflecting on it now, is that it was because of boredom, right, that led me into it. Right, I've been working in the government, particularly in the local government, and at that point I was the chief of staff of a governor, and I felt that I was quite overwhelmed by incremental change, by status quo, by hierarchy, and of course dynastic politics. And then working as chief of staff in the last 3 years made me realize that since before that I was a professor, and I had this feeling that suddenly I came to the realization that I've been dealing with the same problem for almost a decade, right? So the status quo, and that was what, in 2010. From 2000 to 2010, I was studying these things as a public administration student until I had the opportunity to advise chief executives and legislators that, I realized that I kept on, looping around in a closed loop, about the same problem that we've been dealing with in the same 10 years. Now, I felt that I was in a trap. And is there a way for me to actually transcend that frame of experience? Right. And then suddenly, at that point, I was also a PhD student in political science. And political science in the Philippines is pretty quite driven and oriented, highly orientated by American Philippine political science. And then there were a lot of systems thinking at that point, and systems change, at least from American political scientists. And I started to wonder if there are different ways of actually like trying to figure out and make sense and just, go beyond the type of mental models that I've been using or been used to. And I was searching for some methodologies, and suddenly I found something about, those things that they do at the University of Hawaii, particularly on causal layered analysis and emerging issues analysis. I went into them, so I tried to study it, emailed them, and they responded graciously, and they sent me some of their books. And that when my curiosity started to like fly, right? Like, what would it look like? So with that in mind, I proposed to the department in using the tools and methods, but unfortunately during that time, no one was doing futures in the department. So what I did was to drop my PhD quest and spend my time to explore what exactly is future studies or futures thinking. That's when I enrolled in my first course on futures thinking that was organized by the World Future Studies Federation in Malaysia. And at that time, also, there was a World Future Studies Federation conference in Malaysia. So I spent 2 weeks, learning about this. And after that, when I flew back to the Philippines, like in the airplane, is that what I'm going to do about it? So I just started to think about, might as well like learn by doing it, and then set up the Center for Engaged Foresight after a year, and then invited some network. Futurist Network is pretty quite amazing. Friends and colleagues are just one of the best people that I have met, and that's where the journey begins, right?
Well, and so I know we really want to talk about the game and the design of the game, which Aicha will put when we get there into the chat, because you have a wonderful website that just launched 2 months ago for this experience that you've designed. But before we get there, say a little bit, if you would, about your role as chair of the Association of Professional Futurists, and where you see the state of the field, in particular, being situated where you are in the Philippines. Where are we going? What are you seeing? What are you excited about?
Yeah, what I'm excited about the Association of Professional Futurists, perhaps I would say for the next 10 years, is that it will become even more global. The practice becoming more heterogeneous. And the idea of being a professional futurist is actually being questioned at the moment, in trying to figure out what exactly would that be. Because it's not just about organizational management anymore. Like 20 years ago, that was primary as far as the APF is concerned, but then it has gone beyond management, right? At least in the context of strategic foresight or applied foresight. And that it has been pretty quite amazing to see the changes that has happened over the years, from generation 1 to, I would say, the current generation of foresight practitioners, is that emergence is actually some sort of a buzzword now among futurists. And us trying to figure out what exactly that would look like and how might it impact the way we do foresight in the last 20 to 30 years. And as far as access to the services, and the knowledge base of the Association of Professional Futurists, is that we've made them free in the last 2 years. And as far as its membership is concerned, we're trying to figure out to open it up, to make it accessible for people, but at the same time, ensure that it's pretty quite solid as well in terms of providing pathways by which people can actually do professional foresight, if I may use that term.
Yeah.
And ethics as well. I think that's the next frontier of foresight, among other emerging tools and methods that we're currently seeing, given the fact that the demand and the supply, the market as far as foresight is concerned is so amazing, the changes that probably, forces of change brought to what foresight is today requires that we need perhaps to rethink and reimagine foresight for the next 30 years. And what concerns most of my colleagues currently at the moment is going beyond the tools and the methods. In fact, there's no scarcity of that, definitely not. But then the issue of what ethics of practice could guide us along the way, because if they consider our profession, I would say, if we consider this as a professional or practice or discipline, as something reputable and acknowledge in the sense that you can actually use this like those that enhances or amplifies the value of our clients and stakeholders, among others in the world, is that there should be some sort of accountability as far as practitioners is concerned, because they're going to pay for it. And apparently, some colleagues has told me that there are many profiles on LinkedIn that claims to be one. And that is definitely some sort of premise or some assumptions that we currently have that, how do we make it work, right? Like that eventually you'll be able to harness really some sort of, a reputable organization as far as the APF is concerned, including its membership. So we're trying to navigate on that. But then, of course, there are cases on which or by which other professional, occupations has done in the last several years, just to ensure that there is customer, protection and safety as far as the people that we serve is concerned. So accountability is a major thing. Definitely a conversation for the next several years.
Yeah, ethics, accountability, accessibility, heterogeneity, I think all really important. Thank you so much for that. So the questions for those who are here with us, it's fair game to ask any questions about the association, about the practice of foresight, about foresight in Asia, if that's something, if you're a practitioner there. But I want to really focus now on your Dreams of Disruption game. Can you tell us a little bit about the game, about all of the effort that you've put into it, the experience of designing it? Why did you create it? How did you create it? Just tell us about this game, Dreams of Disruption.
Oh, yes. Yeah. At one time, it came upon me about, just reflecting on the way we do foresight, perhaps as far as my practice is concerned. And the learnings that I had over the years was the idea of making foresight practice logical and systematic. And in the sense that as far as, the scaffoldings that we use, just to make sure that there's contextual reality in that what we do, and try to figure out and make sense of what the forces of change are, is that the practice has always been about us having some sort of, I would say, the agency to actually scope and select and choose and rank the forces of change that we can use as some sort of logic or scaffolding in the way we imagine the future. But then we also have the premise, the idea of course, we don't predict the future. The future cannot be predicted. But then, of course, if you try to look into, just to borrow the words of the World Future Studies Federation recently, the liminality, of the forces of change and the scenarios that we make, is that while we claim that we do not predict the future, the fact that we get to choose our forces of change and make sense of them,
Mhm.
amplifies, perhaps impress upon our clients that this is still forecasting, because that's what forecasting do,
Yeah.
right? So we get to select and choose and rank them, right? And then we have archetypes that enables us to use them as a method, and then thereby as a lens to imagine what the world could look like. And more often than not, the drivers or forces of change that in our list are, I would say, evidence-based. They are highly correlated with each other.
Mhm.
But what if they are not,
Mm.
right? What if they are not, right? Like, so if we get to like place this in the context of complex adaptive systems,
Mhm.
right? That we acknowledge, of course, emergent things that are, I would say, unknowable things. So where does unknowable play in the way we do foresight, right? If the forces of change that we get to choose and run are all knowables, right? So it could be some sort of, more often than not, I've seen this, that if there are elements that are missing that makes unknowable interesting for people to do foresight, or perhaps we do foresight, but then we don't acknowledge unknowabilities in the practice, is that we end up creating the same scenarios that are informed by the forces of change that are currently evidenced by trends.
Mm.
And then while we use different tools and methods into the process, is that we end up spreading out the default future into 4 alternative future scenarios, right? Now, where there's no wrong about that, but that's not exciting, right? Like, so is this the end game of foresight? Is this what foresight really is all about? Just filling in the blanks and generating scenarios that are not necessarily like plural, but it's just that the narrative are placed in the context of alternative futures, but then they're still default futures, because perhaps because we've gotten to using trend drivers that are evident and apparent today. I'm not saying that's wrong, but that's primarily the mainstream practice at the moment. But then my question was, where does randomness come into foresight work, right? So I get to ponder on this during the pandemic. The provocation that I had was that questioning transformation. Really, like, everybody is into this thing before the pandemic. Transformation here, transformation that. The UN would introduce a program they called the management of social transformation, because everybody's talking about transformation. But then I tried to question the idea of transformation, right? Like, about, like, for example, my background in the last 7 years has pretty quite been invested on risk management. And I started to ponder whether or not lurking in all of this transformational narrative, are there risk or unknowables that are perhaps embedded in these narratives of transformation? How do you exactly like unpack these things and reveal them? And in fact, when you try to use transformation and shift an organization to that kind of narrative, is that we get to see transition risk, right? From as far as change is concerned, there will always almost be agendas about transitioning or transition risk, which is of course the domain of risk management. So how do you mitigate, the implications of transition risk from status quo to transformation, right? And those were the questions that I had. But then going back to the idea of randomness, I get to read the book of Nassim Nicholas Taleb that would rather, I would say, reinforce the assumption that I had when he said that complex systems are killed or weakened in the absence of randomness. Now, and then I started to check into the practice that I had, and I started to check into the literature as far as foresight is concerned in the field, is that have we been doing randomness really, right? Like what exactly it is. So that's when I tried to like build the game. That was the context and the foundation of building the game Dreams and Disruptions. But then, of course, the intention of inventing the game was to use gamification to facilitate learning as far as scenario building is concerned. That's the purpose of the game, right? But then, of course, embarking in the context of randomness. And I was wondering, what's the best way for me to actually incorporate randomness? Well, there are patterns of change. There are also randomness, right? So that was what I had. And of course, given the constraints that I have when it comes to knowing what games are available out there that facilitate randomness, one that was familiar to me were card games, right?
Right.
So it's easy for people to play cards, right? Like they don't need to learn a new game, and the learning curve gets confusing in the process, and you don't really get the learning in the end, because the game construction is pretty quite difficult. So I thought of, okay, what is that game that I can use that's pretty quite easy for people, and I could get the hang of playing the game, gaming foresight. So the low-hanging fruit was card game. But then, of course, the elements of the game were far more important, than the way how the game is played. So Dreams and Disruption is a scenario building game that incorporates scenario archetypes, time horizon, emerging driving forces of change, leaders and movements, and planetary types of disruptions. So the game can be played whatever you want. Of course, you can actually be inventive about it. But the process, generic to the process, is that it can be played in three phases. One is the phase one is the dreaming part, right? So the dreaming part is that you get to draw a card of the scenario archetype, right? Like for learning purposes, easy to use, weird, preferred, or worse, or disowned future.
Wait,
right?
So what are the archetypes again? Weird,
preferred, worst future scenario.
And worst?
Worst, yes.
Weird, preferred, and worst. So there's three.
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
got it.
Yeah. And the emerging and then you have the time horizon, which is 10 years, 30 years, and 100 years. Right? Strategic, short-term, strategic, long-term. And then, of course, the 100 years stuff that we do, right? The long-term future. So, and then, of course, you have emerging forces of change. So what I've included in as variables for the game are emerging issues, right? Like you have nature drivers of change, political drivers, economic, cultural, technological, ethics, spiritual, and cultural drivers of change. Yeah. And then the forces of change that were identified as prompts are more often than not, I would say 70% of it are emerging issues. Then I tried to combine it with some recurring forces of change that's been there in let's say, the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Right? Like, for example, a religious driver and an ethical driver, let's just say atheism, right? Yeah. So, or a nature worship, those kinds of stuff. So, and then, of course, you draw these cards without you knowing what they are. And more often than not in the game that I play with my clients, that they tend to draw cards that are not correlation, right? So those types of forces of change that are not really like those things that we don't correlate on a daily basis for strategic purposes. But then the question is, what if you have a forces of change that talks about nature worship as a premise, right? Description of nature worship as a premise, and nanotechnology.
Right.
So if you combine nature worship and nanotechnology, what would the future look like in a preferred future scenario 30 years from now? Right? So people get to wonder about what would that look like, right? About the values that nanotechnology have, when you invent things informed and driven by nature worship. So, and then what if the third forces of change, let's just say, is polyarchy, as a political polyarchy.
Polyarchy, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not
familiar
what is that?
Yeah, a polyarchy is some sort of an emerging system where everyone, has the power to create their own communities.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So as opposed to hierarchy or a kind of,
Yes.
yeah.
It
Okay.
becomes
Got
poly,
it.
right? Like, yeah. So, what would it look like? In that context, if you combine polyarchy, nature worship, and nanotechnology, what would a preferred future look like 30 years from now? And of course, initially, people starts to wonder and ponder what would that look like, because previously they haven't thought about these things as forces of change. And the one insight that was shared in a workshop that I had with communication specialists in the environment is that they began to experience what it feels like to realize our borders of imagination. Right? This is what it feels like, to be held in some sort of a glass wall, and you cannot imagine further or farther beyond the glass wall. Right. But then, of course, you continue to some sort of give them time to actually just imagine what would it look like. And in my experience in playing the game in the last 3 years is that I'm pretty quite surprised of how people are become imaginative when you give them the space and the time to imagine the unthought of futures. Right. So
I love, actually, I want to get to, it's really interesting, and you described it really well. I want to get to some of the details, which folks are asking. And I know that you also did have, so there was a question about, do you have any examples of the game? And I know that you had, before we were talking earlier, and you said that you had one or two case studies that maybe you had to share. People are interested in how many people need to play, how long does a game take, do you win, what does winning look like, do you need a moderator? So these are some of the questions.
Yeah, there's no winning in this game, right? Games can be constructed with winners and losers.
Yes.
But some games need not have to have winners, right? But in this game, everybody wins because they get to share what their imaginings are. And, I feel that excites people, especially when they discover something that they haven't previously thought about. So now about some cases, I would like to show you some cases. But then, of course, again, while there is randomness, you have the opportunity to think about unthought of future, but still, as a context, I think contextual reality is very important, especially for specific geographies and communities and culture, among other things. We're going to build on things that what we know as far as our memories are concerned, including our identities, right? So it's pretty kind of subjective, but it gives people the opportunity to just imagine the unthought of future using what they have, as people and as an organization. So one example is this. So we play the game with some folks in Jamaica, right? And they were able to come up with this future. The contextual reality is the metaphor of the Rastafari thing, right? That we do informed by music, among other things. But then, of course, they are surrounded by oceans. They were given prompts, right? And those prompts that I just, for example, gave you as an example, so they had a different prompt. So the prompt appears to be ocean finance. The prompt was cities. The prompt would be philosophies. For example, I think the philosophy here was nature worship. And this were the ideas that they were able to curate and imagine, like a Rastafari future world in the year 2050. Harnessing ocean waves to power coastal communities and future economies, of island countries. And they had this idea of ocean algae to solve global hunger. And then perhaps now is the time to go back to what our indigenous, tradition tells us about ocean as a philosophy. And what would it look like if we develop this philosophy that is driven and informed by our understanding about oceans and seas is the idea of okay, what would an ocean lifestyle look like, right? What would the economy look like? How would we treat others, right, beyond humans when it comes to their rights and their identities, and perhaps giving them some sort of a personhood in the process. And we've seen that this is actually emerging in New Zealand, wherein they gave the river a legal personality, that the river can actually sue you. And this also leads to the question about what would foresight practice look like if nature is a persona, right? Because eventually, in playing this game, I'll also realize that foresight is pretty quite human-centered. It's just about us when we talk about the future. But then it need not have to be like that, especially now that we're having a conversation about planetary futures. And another one was a workshop that I had with a group in London, was or Edinburgh, I think it was Edinburgh, about this. Of course, they had different prompt, and then they were thinking about some unthought of future here, which is, of course, the time horizon was 100 years, is the idea of spiritual abundance, wherein super virtual societies lead to highly spiritualized global societies wherein we get to know what it feels like, or simulate or feel what the future looks like, in a future wherein exploration of these things, including its utility, would look like. So then they would generate some ideas about setting up well-being excellence centers that eliminates the scarcity of abundance mindset, exclusion of others, mental and spiritual depression, the idea of setting up peace cooperatives, and the concept of Spiritual Tech Equity and Fair Access Act of 2150. Because with these prompts, they have this views of what if spirituality becomes a public good, right? And what would it look like if you have goods and services in the process? Like, would you have some insurances? Would spirituality become a universal right? Would it become a product or services? What would that look like? Yeah. So those are just two of the examples. But then, of course, there are many examples. I plan to share this example, of course, with the permission of those that I played with in the process, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do just that.
Thank you. That's super interesting. So can you give us a sense for those? Let's just pick the one example. Let's say the Rastafari 2050 example. How long did it take to play the game? And did you play it in person? Did you play it online? Yeah, just give us a sense of how it actually works.
Yeah, yes. So we played it for 1.5 hours.
Okay.
Right, virtually. Yeah, you can play for 1.5 hours virtually. Depends on the number of players you have in the virtual room. So if you only have around 5, 6, or 7, you can actually play that for 40 to 60 minutes. But then you have more players, let's just say in a group, you have a group of 10. And the purpose is that people need to, you have to give them some space to actually interact and ponder and wonder and imagine, because imagination takes time, right? You need to give them some opportunities for actually just feel what it feels like to imagine these things, and feel what it feels like to live in this future. And I think by designing it in a way that people could actually feel what it feels like to experience magic, especially when it comes to emergence, you have to give them some time, right?
Yes.
So, but then you can also play what I've been doing recently is for example, you have 100 people in the room, right? So you can just play the game for 100 people in the plenary, and you facilitating the conversation using the question prompts, or perhaps the questions that emerges as you play the game can drive the conversation ahead. People just sharing what they have in mind in the chat. And of course, you can actually design a mirror board for it, so that you can actually take note of the brilliant ideas that they have in mind, and then give them an opportunity to see the big picture, of course, through the mirror board, and then just facilitate, a conversation wherein they could actually connect their unthought of futures together, and then build the scenarios together.
So does
But then okay, Lynn. Yes, please.
Well, I was just going to say, so does the website, when we go to the website, are there instructions? I know that there's a physical card game. Is there also a way to play the game on the website, or how do you suggest that people who are here learn how to moderate and do this for themselves? Since I think this is probably what you're trying to do, is have more people play the game and facilitate gameplay.
Yes, in fact, that's one of our plans. The Center for Engaged Foresight is, to launch a series of, a global activities so that people can actually learn how to play the game. So we were thinking of, offering some courses about these things, particularly on dreams and disruption, training people on how to actually play the game, and then, build it in the context and premise of, what is the reason why you are playing the game in the first place. But then we will have some events and activities in the next 6 months. So we're just trying to put some schedules on that. So of course, watch out for it.
Okay.
But then of course, then before I forget, several, I think this is important, is that as far as playing the game is concerned, it's not just about building the scenarios per se. The unthought of futures, if you're lucky to even think about, the unthought of future, I hope they emerge as you play the game. But the intent is as well is to stress test it, right? Because scenarios are supposed to evolve. So the idea was that, okay, you have these scenarios about, emergent futures, for example. The next phase of the game is the question about exploring the question of, how might your scenarios look like if it enters the domain of leadership, right? Or it enters the domain of movements. So what would your scenarios look like from the perspective of a laborer? What would it look like from the perspective of a military? What would it look like from the context of a venture capitalist? What would it look like in the context of an intellectual? If you get to choose, like, for example, a priest or a bishop or whatever that might be, the persona that you wish to use. What are the strategies, innovations, policies, that this persona can actually come up with?
And is that part of the game? Is that currently part of the game? Or
yes, it is part of the game.
Okay, very good.
So yeah, and
I want to make sure I get to some of these questions. So we had a lot of questions. Todd, or just a basic question, if you can just clarify, is the game free? Does it cost money? Is it available online, or is it physical, or maybe both? Let's just get that out of the way and clarify that.
Yes, in the last 2 years, it has been free. We've been playing this for free in the last 2 years, but then we produced the card version of this. And the card version, the price is $65.
Okay.
Right, so you can place, if you're interested to get a copy of that, I'll be sharing you the website. It would be great if you can share the website here so that people can actually place, if you're interested, your orders.
Yes,
and
we
then
did.
We're going to set up some sessions with those who have that card, at least, for them to actually learn how to actually facilitate the gaming part.
Very good. So I think, what I find so interesting is the combination of, as you said, patterns of change plus randomness. When you're working with a group, you still have to choose. You as the moderator, I suppose, are choosing the set of cards that you want the people to work with. Is that right? Or is it completely random? Because with the Rastafari group, of course, they're on an island. So I'm imagining you may have chosen some issues or cards that were relevant for them. Or is it meant to be completely random, anyone, anytime, anything?
Yes, it's completely random, right? The variables, you get to draw them from the card. We're trying to figure out how to build a virtual game because, the forces of change can be more extensive, right? But then, of course, in a card game, like a physical card, you have to think about the cost, right? So you have to some sort of make it feasible for you in terms of cost, right? And then, still, make that available as some sort of a product, for people to play with. But that's just the purpose of it. But then the intent of the game really is, having the opportunity to build scenarios out of randomness.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So there's a question from Jason Harris. It was one of the first questions we had, which he says, you talked about how imagination is the currency of foresight. And the question is, what can you do to activate the narrative outcomes of the game? How does the game help people? And I want to combine this with another question from Fabrice, which you also spoke to a little bit, because the power of imagination does depend on the experience of the individual, right? The lived experience and the context of the individual. How do you go beyond that experience? How do you activate the narrative outcomes? How do you help people do that? So just say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So about that is where the reflection comes in. Right? It's not necessarily in the game, but it could be a part of the game process. Like at the end, like you have some sort of an open space, and just have a space for people to reflect on what they felt, what were their insights, and what were the challenges. So it becomes a facilitation among them. Right? It's not necessarily in the game, but then the game experience enables you to do that. Right? And then it might not be in the forces of change or the type of leadership that you have, or the planetary variables, like, for example, let's just say a comet hitting planet Earth in the process that could change the way you see the future or perceive or even imagine it, with disruptions in mind, is them like just asking questions now, right? Like, and of course, in terms of foresight, just to respond to the first question, is that of course this is not unique to foresight. In fact, this is evident in all of I would say the disciplines and the knowledge that we build, for hundreds and thousands of years, including science, in recent years, is that there are two purposes of knowledge, really. One is for exploration. For science, I would say, including foresight, is for exploration and the utility of it, right? So I think one of the evident conversation really at the moment now is to think about how to use the future, right? And how to use it. And the premise of using the future is extraction.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And sometimes we end up exploiting it, right? As an asset, a resources, or a tool.
Yeah.
But then we have to be cautious about that. But I'm not saying that it's wrong, right? That it's unethical or what, because utility, as far as the external world is concerned, is very essential, right? In the way we build, for example, our plans, strategies, because that's real world, in fact. But then, of course, by playing the game, is that what the game accentuates is exploration. Beyond utility, because unthought of futures are not useful today. They're not, right? Imaginations aren't necessarily useful right away, right?
Yeah,
but then,
yeah. No. I think you're absolutely right. We have so a couple of connections to other work that's, I think, related in some ways. Our colleague here at the Institute, Jane McGonigal, of course, had a book called Imaginable, which is really making a similar argument. And she actually has something that she calls imagination leadership training. And I was talking to someone about, is this something, do you think that organizations might find it useful? And this person is an expert in adult learning, executive education, leadership training. And she said, and she's very, very good. And she said, I think they would, but I think you would have to convince them of the value of imagination. So, there's a whole piece to foresight, which is trying to have people give themselves permission to imagine, to help them understand where imagination fits within decision-making processes, all of those kinds of things. So, and then there's another futures game called The Thing from the Future, which I'm sure from Stuart Candy. And there's a question about whether, and the Situation Lab, whether you've seen or played that game and what you think of that one. Was that an inspiration, perhaps? I don't know if you're familiar with that game, The Thing from the Future, also a card game.
Oh, yes, definitely yes. You know, been playing that Thing from the Future game in the last 3 years.
Yes.
In fact, when the Dreams and Disruption did not exist yet, you know, I was playing the Thing from the Future game. And kind of really provocative, right? In the sense that, okay, wow, this is just amazing, right? The focus was on things, right? So what would this look like? Right?
Yeah.
And then the premise was on things, right? And then, but I think what the magic that game gives me is that it's just wonderful, right? Like, yeah, it makes people excited about scenarios.
Yeah.
So imagine without gamification, let's just say that here's the thing. Imagine what scenario work looks like with or without games. Right? So it becomes some sort of a mechanistic thing, right? Like we build the scenarios, do the drivers of change, you know, set the data, right? Like, so it becomes so mechanistic and I would say boring. And at the same time, you know, people, you know, getting into it and just playing in the sense of, you know, filling in the blanks, right? Like more often than not. But then if you get to unpack that, you know, we're just talking about the same thing here. While we call them plural futures, they're still the same, right? But then when you incorporate games before you actually do the scenario planning, my experience, the insight that I gathered when I incorporate games into my client projects is that they feel liberated, right? That, you know, this is now a safe space to actually like imagine. Of course, we're going to deal with the business as usual default projected future. We're going to take care about that. We're going to take care about the continued economic growth. But then the most challenging part will always be the outlier parts, right? Like, because people are not used to it. But when they play games, they feel liberated and they know what imagination feels or look like when you use them in in planning, strategy, or innovation. Is that they feel that they are more liberated to actually have a conversation about this instead of them being condemned.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's a wonderful tip and advice for people to facilitate and work with groups, even very serious groups, and strategic planning processes, to have a kind of a game-like experience to make it, you know, a little bit lighter. And as you said, to introduce those elements of randomness to kind of spark the imagination. So a couple more questions. Someone said, hearing you talk about drivers that are combined, I'm under the impression that with this game, people can have in their mind 4 drivers instead of the usual 2. Am I right? What are the barriers and most encountered behaviors in that context?
Yes, in fact, that was one of the insights of one of my clients. Like, of course, why only 3 drivers, Sherman? Like, it could have been more. And my answer is really the cost of the cards, because if you put more cards, the deck becomes even more expensive. It's just about foundational things, right? Like you get to experience it. I think that's the purpose of the game. Because if you put more drivers, right, it becomes thicker, it becomes more costly, and of course, you know, it's a matter of cost as well in the process. But then, of course, as far as if you wish to use the game, you can actually like modify it.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you wish to include more archetypes, that's fine. Right. And then you tell me about your experience. Right. And then, you know, I would love to hear your thoughts about it. Right. So and then hopefully we'll be able to build some gameplays in many ways beyond the generic gameplay that the game currently have.
Yeah. I think that will be really fun to see the applications and how people start to do that. And so we've got two different questions for ideas. I think they would like to hear your perspective for applying this in a specific context. One is, would the game be usable to bring several stakeholders together to think about the future of the labor market? And then there's a second question from Mitchell. who says, I wonder how the game would go if the players were some of the Hamas leaders and some of the Israeli leaders playing about the future of that area. Can it be played when people are starting from such different perceptions and values?
Yeah, with the current version of it, not. I don't want to put so much expectation into the game because that's the current version. But then, of course, if you wish to customize it, go for it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the point of it. But then, please share us what you have. In fact, now I have 2 projects coming up wherein we get to customize the game according to particular context.
Nice.
Yes, like science, technology, innovation, and climate change, for example. So yes, but then that would require some research, and then of course, design and curation. Like, what are the variables that you need to include if there were emerging issues, right? Like, so and then the persona part and the disruption part.
Got it. So the customization would come in making sure that you have a complete, what feels like a more complete set of drivers, emerging issues and personas for the context. Is that right?
Yes. In fact, if you do that and customize it, I've seen this, that one of my previous clients, the Department of Health, for example, in the Philippines, made a customization of that game. A little bit of customization because it takes, some work that you need to invest on this if you wish to customize it. But what I see is that if you customize it, it becomes a scenario generating platform in itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we're getting closer to the end of our time, so I want to make sure I get these last questions. There is a quick question about how do you play this game online that is accessible to those who don't have mural boards or Miro boards? Is there a way to do that currently?
Yes. In fact, that's one thing that we have in mind currently, right? Like, we're looking for some, developers who can help us build the digital version of this. Yeah, we're still looking into it and trying to talk to some people who can actually like assist us on this, and then hopefully eventually we'll have the digital version available in the next probably perhaps hopefully next year.
Great. Then we have a question on 2 questions. So the first one is, many topics and themes are surprisingly becoming taboo or are being canceled nowadays, which undoubtedly impacts futuring. Players involved often overlook these issues. How do you handle taboo or canceled subjects in your work?
Now, so far, I haven't seen that one or people asking me about those things. But then I think when you gamify these things, right, like, just at the outset says, perhaps you can say it at the outset that, this is a game, this is play, right? Like, we get to test ourselves about these ideas, regardless of what we think about it. In fact, now I remember one insight that was shared with me after this person played the game in one of the events at UNESCO that we did. And then he said this, I think he was a communist. And then he said this, I played with my own biases using my ideologue, right? But it got me thinking whether or not ideologies are relevant at all when change evolves and disrupt and randomness come into play. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, so there was a question about astrology, and astrology being one of the earliest forms of practicing foresight. And I'm just thinking now, the concept of the black swan, of course, is similar, I think, related to kind of what you're doing here, but not exactly the same, obviously, but related in that it's trying to introduce kind of random, sudden emergence into futuring and into planning, future planning. And I've always found it very difficult, the black swan. It's not really a practice that we use at the Institute, because someone has to make decisions about what the black swan is. And so you're already pre-baking and pre-narrowing the conversation by choosing whichever black swan you choose. So I appreciate the randomness of the cards. And it really is, I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about the nature of randomness and how many times you could play the game, you know, to try to see all the things that could occur in it. But last question, and then I want to share a few things that are coming up at the Institute to make sure everyone knows that they're coming up, some open talks and foresight talks. So can you comment on what you have seen using spiritual drivers? I cannot see the value as a future driver. Most are evergreen, but the strength and visibility of one or the other is the actual signal, in my opinion. Of course, there is always a possibility for something new. I'm curious how you explain the category to people so it is useful.
I don't explain the categories to people. You know, it's for them to figure it out, right? Remember that this is a game. You know, we don't define what the forces of change for them. They need to figure it out themselves, especially when you have a community or a collective of people, you know, trying to make sense of it, right? But then remember, this is a game, right? It's play.
Yeah.
So the fun element has to be there, right? So it's not like some sort of, okay, it's a scenario planning exercise. No, it is not, right? It's a learning tool, right? So
I love it.
yeah, but of course, if there will be some questions about that, you can actually like have a conversation with these people later on about those things if they have those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Right, because these are important questions, and that's the reason why games are played, you know, to prompt questions, you know, radical or not, right? And yeah, these are the things that you can address and have a communication about, you know, conversation about after the game.
I love it. I love it. A good reminder of the practice of playing rather than planning, you know, and rather than analysis or consulting or all the different kinds of practices that we do, research, you know. I love that. So Sherman, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I think we've all learned a lot. We have put the link to the game and to the Dreams and Disruptions game once more in here. Please do reach out to Sherman and his team if you're playing the game. Would love to. I'm sure they would love to see how this is happening. And I want to, before everyone leaves, just point out we have some really interesting talks coming up. Thursday, December 7th, we have a talk from the principal research scientist at Hitachi America. She's going to be talking about the way that she has combined a kind of internal Hitachi forecasting processes with some of the external foresight practices, specifically around alignment and ethics on technology's role in our lives. So that's going to be very interesting, I think. And then we also have in January, our first one for next year will be with EDUCAUSE, which is going to be looking at EDUCAUSE is at least in the United States, one of the leading voices on futures of education. And they have, they do scenarios, they do horizon scanning, and they're going to be talking about their foresight practice. Because of course, the purpose of these kinds of conversations is to focus on the practice and the community kind of behind the scenes. What do we actually do and how do we do it? Sherman, there's a request for you to join the Urgent Optimists community. I know you've been invited, but you have so many communities you're part of. Once again, thank you so much for joining us at such a late hour. And thank you everyone for joining us from around the world.
Thank you, Lynn.
We will call it a wrap at that.